Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I'm Sid Partu, joining me today is...
Steve Paxi.
And what are we talking about today, Steve? Oh no.
Alright, so today we are talking about Michael Mann's fourth movie from 1992, The Last of the Mohicans, starring Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah, based on the classic American novel of the same title. I'm trying to remember the name of the author.
The novel is written by James Cooper, but the movie is also a remake of a 1930s movie that was based on the novel as well.
Mm-hmm. So this was an interesting pick for you to pull out. I was a little surprised by the little preamble there. Did you not like this movie, Steve?
We can get into it in more detail as we go on. The long story of why I picked it essentially is I saw Ferrari over Christmas, Michael Mann's newest movie with Adam Driver, and I really, really loved it, and I thought it was getting kind of underappreciated. So I decided to go back and watch all of Michael Mann's movies because there was there were some here and there that I'd never seen. Like I'd never seen The Keep before, I never saw Manhunter before, and I've never seen Black Hat. So I just thought he's one of those people that has like a very manageable filmography, where you can watch one movie of his a week and be done in maybe 2 months. So I decided to do that and go back from the very beginning. And when Michael Mann gets started, he makes a perfect movie. He makes the quintessential perfect crime movie. He makes Thief in 1981, which is just fucking flawless. Then he makes The Keep, which is not good, but is really interesting. And then he makes Manhunter, which is kind of the combination of the two, where it feels like he found his style and his sensibilities in The Keep, but he has the clockwork precision of Thief all in one package.
Okay, let me just make sure I'm on the right track here. When you say Manhunter, you're talking about the film that was eventually remade as Red Dragon?
Yes. We're talking about the first Hannibal Lecter movie, basically.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, just making sure we're on the same page. Okay.
Yeah, so he does that, and to be honest, I like that movie better than Silence of the Lambs.
Well, you're wrong, but sure.
So you watch those three movies, and all three of them are pretty low budget. All three of them are really relatively constrained movies. The biggest budget of the three is Manhunter, which is $14 million or something. And then after Manhunter, there's a little bit of a lull, and he comes back and does Last of the Mohicans. And it's a really interesting movie historically from seeing him grow as a director, because this movie's budget is bigger than all three of his last movies combined. And he's working for the first time with genuinely A-list actors in the form of Daniel Day-Lewis. And everything in this movie is made on real sets. They go on real locations. They filmed over actual forests and stuff. They made Daniel Day-Lewis learn how to shoot an old school bolt action rifle and load it while running. So all the shit that you see him do with those rifles, he can actually fucking do, which is nuts. They made him go through sword training and stuff to learn how to fight with a tomahawk. And it's a epic in scope, and it's the first time he ever did anything like that. And the history of the production's interesting too, because everyone's like, oh yeah, Michael Mann's got it together. Michael Mann's like a general. He had the whole vision outlined from the very beginning, and it's just so surprising to hear when it's only his fourth movie, and by far the biggest thing he'd done up to that point. And so in context, I think there's a lot of stuff to appreciate about Michael Mann as a director and his approach in the movie. The movie on a whole is just kind of okay. I think it's fine. I think it falls into a lot of the traps that Michael Mann says he'd wanted to avoid, because the book is pretty white saviory and racist, and so is the original movie that it's based on. And Mann in interviews is like, yeah, the book is terrible, it's awful, no one should read it. So I wanted to remake it and give it some more nuance. And I'm like, I don't know if you really did, but okay.
That's interesting. I don't really know if I'd consider the book white saviory or not. I think it's like you can only expect so much given the time it came out is like less than 100 years after the events that it is covering.
Yeah.
So you could certainly only expect so much. Like I initially was like, when I saw Daniel Day-Lewis in the credits, I was like, maybe he's gonna be one of the British guys or something. Like you see a bunch of Native American dudes right through the woods, and there's fucking Daniel Day-Lewis. So I was like, oh, I don't know about this. And then like you get the context of his character. I'm like, okay, fair enough. That certainly has the potential to have happened. I was more like interested. I actually did a little bit of research on this because I don't know a ton about the history surrounding it with the French Indian War, as it's called here in the Americas. So I wasn't really sure what to make of some of the stuff. So I was doing some research, and I was quite intrigued to know that. So there's that whole scene at the end where the guy's like, "And I am the last of the Mohicans," and it's like very sad and shit. But
Yeah.
so the Mohicans are still around.
Yeah.
Today. But no, like that sounds like a dig at it, right? But it's like it's a really interesting thing to look at within the context of when it was written, because the Mohicans are still around today, and they have a tribe of roughly 1,500 people, which is tiny. I think like more people went to my high school, so it's a very, very small tribe. And when the dude was writing the book, that number was smaller. Mm-hmm. So like he was kind of, looking at it and going, "There's just no way that this tribe is going to survive. So I'm going to make my story about them." And there's like a bittersweet irony and like a solemnness about the fact that these tribes are disappearing. That these peoples are being wiped out. And the movie certainly takes some time to like deal with that. But yeah, there's still a lot of that white savioriness, and I think that it's ultimately like not entirely the movie's fault, because I really don't think that 90s Hollywood even fully understood what that trope was at that time. Because here's a challenge, Steve. The 90s are very well known for all of the Native American movies suddenly getting made that Hollywood had been holding off on for so long. So, is there a critically acclaimed, famous 90s Native American movie that doesn't have a white savior, that isn't the one about the two Indian teenagers in the 90s? I can't fucking remember the name of that one off the top of my head. I think it's like Smokestacks or something like that.
Specifically 90s, I don't remember. Because yeah, you're right. The sort of avalanche of Native American movies did sort of start coming off at this point. But there's like a lot of them back to back, because you have Dances with Wolves just like a couple years before this.
Smoke Signals is
Smoke Signals, yeah. Yeah. And then Smoke Signals, I want to say, is also late 90s. Little Big Man is a little bit older, but that's another big one. I'm trying to think of other ones off the top of my head, but I just don't know. But yeah, there was definitely a slew of these, and you're right. The trope didn't exist in the way we talk about it now. At that point.
No, I mean, I think it did. It's just that like the Hollywood really was not fully able to comprehend it. I think that these movies are all responsible for the trope.
Yeah, we were in the middle of making the trope in real time, and then historically you can go back and see how many of movies were made in the 90s that did the same thing. Like, you look at something like The Last Samurai, right? And The Last Samurai is also very much of that ilk. So, I mean, White Savior as a concept is much older than these movies, but, like, the Hollywood formula of historical epic white savior character was being cultivated in this decade in a way that you couldn't really be conscious of in real time, that it takes some distance to see. And part of why I wanted to talk about it was I think there is a conversation worth having as far as whether or not it represents native culture in the best way might be a separate thing from, is it a good entertaining movie on its own merits. And I think it kind of like 70% gets there, I think. I think that the trouble is with this movie in particular is it's trying to be really overt about the fact that it's giving more nuance to the indigenous characters, but still saddles you with Daniel Day-Lewis as your point of view the entire time. And so instead of getting like a nuanced take on what the indigenous perspective on the French and British was at the time, you are kind of just seeing it still from an outsider white guy perspective regardless, and you are still creating kind of a binary of like, there is the evil ones and then there are the civilized ones, and it doesn't really sort of thread that needle as well as it could, especially because I feel like the early parts of the movie, like the first like half an hour or so, I think are legitimately really good. I think he kind of like creates that political tension between like which tribes would have sided with which side of the conflicts, how the Mohawks were like trading with the British for like 100 years before this even happened, how like there was this slow growth of a pre-capitalist industry inside of native culture for a really long time, well before we got to something like the American Revolution. And I feel like it does some of that stuff really well at the beginning, and then as it goes on, it becomes more formulaic.
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is you can't really expect it to do anything else, given that it is still trying to adapt a book written, in the 1800s.
Yeah.
Kind of nailed that down. What fucking year did that shit come out? Mohicans.
It came out in 1826.
Yeah, so less than 100 years after the events of discussing. So it's not quite contemporary. It's about a generation after, which is interesting. So yeah, it's a really impressive work of its time, and I kind of understand why it became so endeared, because it was, for its time, I think that's a pretty advanced narrative. But I talk about this a lot, where in a lot of historical things, whether it's historical fiction or like fictional characters based in historic events, or even just like showing real people and fictionalizing their lives, there's this trope of presenting the modern thinker, the person in the past who has modern thoughts and ideas. And we as an audience, because we are a modern audience, we identify with, and we it's like a shorthand to instantly show us that this guy knows his shit, this guy understands where things are going. But as time goes on, those examples of the modern thinker begin to become more and more quaint, to the point where they start to become laughable, and so I find it interesting, because what you have here in the example of the book being adapted in this film, that whether or not it's an intentional thing to try to limit some of the more dated ideas of the time it came out in or not, is you have a more modern take on what was already the modern take, and that modern take has become displaced. That modern take has actually fallen out of step with current values. And now you get, this movie's 92, so we're over 30 years after this movie's production, and now the efforts that the filmmakers made have fallen out of step. and it's just an interesting dynamic that creates. I do find it interesting that the Last of the Mohicans is actually book 2 in like a series of books following this fucking white Native American guy.
Yeah. The Leatherstock Tales. It's a series of like, I actually don't know how many, but it's a very long series of books about basically this historical period. Now that you say that, though, because I don't want to be like overly negative to start, because I do think there's a lot of merit here. Not ignoring, but caveating the white savior trope of the character. I do actually really like Daniel Day-Lewis as Hawkeye. I think he's actually really interesting, and I think as an actor he does a lot to kind of reel you in immediately. And Michael Mann's really famous for not necessarily like micromanaging his actors, but like his actors sort of talk about how he always feels like a third presence in the middle of the scene, because there's the person you're acting against, and then there's Michael Mann like right in the middle, because he's got the vision of what the movie needs to look like, so sure. And everyone is just kind of enacting his vision. And Daniel Day-Lewis actually like really responds to that sort of process, because he's reluctant to talk about his acting methodology, or at least was at the time. And so he kind of appreciates just being like the cog in Michael Mann's wheel, because he can just kind of do the thing Mann is looking for. And the more sure Mann is of the vision, the better time Daniel Day-Lewis has of being able to present that vision. And I think you do kind of feel it. I feel like Daniel Day-Lewis going through all the training and stuff of being able to actually do everything you watch in the movie, of him doubling for himself and all the stunts and everything, they do kind of add up to like this degree of excitement or realism that really kind of hits. And like, again, caveating the white guyness, when he's talking to, what's her name, Cora, in the middle of the night as he's helping them travel across the country, and he's explaining the sun and the moon and the creation mythology that he grew up in, it's kind of convincing, and a lot of that has to do with how well lit the scene is, how well shot it is, how it kind of uses that language Mann had developed in The Keep and Manhunter, of having like these really deep blues that he carries on into everything else he's ever made, to kind of represent this sort of surreal, out of time moment where these two characters are just able to isolate and bond with each other. I think all of that works really well.
Yeah, definitely agree with you to one extent or another. This is just the problem. Let me ask you this question real quick. What did you use to watch this?
What do you mean, what did I use?
Like, how did you watch it? Netflix or what?
Oh, I just rented it on Prime.
Okay, so, but you did stream it. Alright.
Mm-hmm.
So, I didn't rent it on Prime, I rented it on Google TV. The Google TV app on my phone is fucking garbage, because, like, I started this movie 4 times in 10 minutes trying to watch the first fucking 2 minutes of this goddamn movie. Because every time my phone screen turned off, the fucking movie stopped casting, and I had to start it over, and like eventually I had to break out a fucking tablet to watch it on. So that was a pain in the ass. But outside of that, also just by nature of these things anymore, the streaming audio was so fucking bad. I couldn't. There were like large stretches of this movie where I could not hear a fucking thing these people were saying. I had to keep like kicking up the volume. So I don't know if like some of that was maybe just lost on me, some of the nuance you're talking about there, because I just couldn't hear what was going on. And I'm being a little bit hard because of how frustrating it was to start the movie. I'll also blame a little bit on my wife, since she decided to run laundry right as I was starting this fucking movie. So I had like even though we had the door closed, and like usually we don't have a problem hearing stuff, it just was not the ideal circumstance. I'll perfectly like grant, but at the same time, maybe just some of the nuance of some of that stuff was lost on me, because I was just struggling to hear anything for like large sections of this movie where they're just very, very fucking quiet around each other.
Okay, I mean, yeah, that's interesting. I was lucky because no one was home when I was watching the movie, so I got to just turn the volume all the way up and keep it that way and just kind of enjoy it all the way through. I'm also kind of annoying because I have subtitles on no matter what I'm watching. so I will always have subtitles to look at if I can't hear. But I didn't really have that problem with this movie. The way I was playing it, everything kind of came through really crystal clear, and it helps a little bit because I'd been watching so many movies from like this era and like right before it, so I kind of knew what I was getting myself into as far as like streaming quality of these kinds of things. Because like good fucking luck trying to find an HD stream of the goddamn Keep, right? Like no one fucking watches that movie. I can't even find a DVD of it. Like relative to the Keep, I feel like I did not have any problems with the visuals or the audio. But I mean, I think even without the audio, you just kind of like what Michael Mann does so well is he's one of the few filmmakers where I feel like color symbolism is not lost on me, because that's something I'm really bad at. It's a thing I've never like really bothered to study or understand, like how colors convey emotions in film. And Michael Mann's like the first and only filmmaker who, like, every time I watch one of his movies, I'm like, get it. Blue means love. Completely understand. Cool. Green means evil. Like, there's so many, like, really clear tells in his work of what the colors mean. And the more you watch his movies, the more he kind of complicates what the color symbolizes over time, particularly, like, when you get to Heat. But in this movie in particular, I think what really works is this is a dude who's gone from like $10 million movies with no-name actors with maybe like one star here and there to making legitimately a big Hollywood picture. And he takes all of like the simple basic language that he's developed up to this point of his color symbolism, of having like this very sort of old school melodrama and shorthand for how romances are going to function, of having this very sort of grounded camera perspective where you're always like following right behind one guy all the time. He's doing all that and he's throwing it into like a big action epic, and you never feel like the scale is outweighing where the human drama is. Is the human drama great? No, not particularly. It's fine. It's kind of generic. I don't think the actress who plays the love interest is particularly good. She's definitely nowhere near as good as Daniel Day-Lewis. I don't think they have a ton of chemistry.
I mean, has anyone ever been as good as Daniel Day-Lewis?
You know, this is a fair point. But like, you know, that's the weekend of that. But I think Mann does everything in his power to make that human side of it work as best as it can, given the script.
Yeah, I didn't really have a problem with any of the acting in this movie. The performance that just blew me away was Magua, the like antagonist Native American character. He is so like just mean. Just like when you get this guy's origin story that he was like sold into slavery and he watched his wife and children die in front of him and stuff, I'm just like, nah, I buy it, because it's not like mustache twirling evil. He's just like, and now I'm a bastard and I don't give a fuck what I have to do to get my goddamn revenge. I'm gonna do it. And it's just, and I buy it 100%. He's just a son of a bitch. It's so cool. Just a cold-blooded motherfucker in this, and I really enjoy that, because again, if you're watching something like this now, we're kind of afraid to do villainous people of color in especially within these contexts of movies. I think like the only other performance that like compares to this would be like Samuel L. Jackson in Django Unchained, where it's just like the most evil black person ever. So like you just get this guy, and he's not this noble, native warrior or something. He's just mad and pissed and just wants revenge, and he's kind of willing to do whatever it's gonna take to get it. He's like, oh yeah, I'll impersonate a scout, or I'll pretend to be this. And it's like really interesting that the British just don't realize that's not their guy, because they don't actually pay any attention to any of the native symbols. I did like that moment where Daniel Day-Lewis and his team show up and they're like, you thought he was a Mohawk? Like, that was really good.
Yeah. I also, what's his name? Mogwa.
Mm-hmm.
I also really liked that the turn he has towards the end, where he's in it for revenge from the very beginning because of what happened to his own children, and he talks in detail about like what he wants to do to who he calls gray hairs children. But when you get towards the end, and he's got them all captured, and he kind of goes on that speech about like how they just need to become capitalists, and that sort of like inadvertently turns into being the whole evil of the whole movie. I really dug that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and like again, it's kind of weird because it's a really good moment, but then it's like delivered by a white man. It's like, so you will become just like your enemy, kind of thing. It's like,
Well, it's like it's a thing we still do, right? It's like when Ryan Gosling, a white guy, explains jazz to John Legend. I'm like, I don't know about this man. Probably shouldn't have been in the movie.
yeah.
It's a weird thing. It's something that you can't ignore, but I feel like when you're getting like swept up in the emotions of the experience, it does kind of sell itself. I think the trouble with his character really starts when you realize that there are kind of only two perspectives to the native side of the conflict, where after the opening, where there is a little bit of like dissent and conflict between whether or not they were going to join the militia, you sidestep a lot of that real quick when there is no choice. And then as the movie goes on, you've got Mogwa, who is the sort of savage, but he's a savage in that he believes in capitalism, which is the real savagery. And then you have the guy at the end whose son dies and declares himself the last of the Mohicans, and that's the noble one. And it sort of feels like they oversimplify what could have been a much more complicated debate to get at sort of a morally right stance at the expense of the uncertainty that you could have had instead. And this is the thing with Mann's movies that I really like, and when he doesn't do it, I feel like they're really unsatisfying, where all of his characters are in one way or another the reflections of the people that they face. Pacino and De Niro are mirrors of each other in Heat, but you have the same sort of thing with Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter and Manhunter, and you've got a similar thing going on in The Keep when you have like the monster in The Keep, and you got like his servant dude played by Stick from the Daredevil TV show, and even in Thief, you've got this layer of mirror of like, it doesn't matter that your main character is doing quote unquote the right thing. In that position, they are also sort of expressing the values of the people they're fighting against. And I think when he's weakest is when he makes that line way too clear. So both this movie and The Insider, which he does after Heat, have like these really clear moral resolutions that I think just oversimplify what could have been a much more interesting story about not just the conflict between the two native characters, but how other native characters are swayed in part by one and the other, that it's not as simple as the noble one and the savage one. I feel like a lot of that nuance doesn't have room to exist because Daniel Day-Lewis is your main character.
Okay, I'm gonna like jump on that and talk about another thing that kind of bothers me about the plot of this movie. And again, it's not necessarily their fault since they're adapting a book, but at the same time, you're choosing what you're adapting to film, right?
And just to aid in your point too, right? Mann doesn't like the book. He's very clear about the fact that he doesn't like the book, so there's no excuse to stick to it.
Yeah. But like, you know, it's a really, really good scene, and the actress gives a tremendously fantastic, understated performance where she could have just really become, like, very annoying, and just, I could have been happy that she ends up jumping off a cliff. But that scene where that woman jumps off that cliff is so fucking sad and intense, because she's just been, like, she starts off a little bit too extra, right? Just a little bit too annoying. And then but then she kind of like fades to the background for a lot of the movie, and you get this like sense where her sister keeps worrying about her, but she seems relatively fine. She only has like one moment where she kind of freaks out a little bit, and Daniel Day-Lewis's brother comes in and helps her. but then seemingly she commits suicide because he's dead and she'd fallen in love with him. Or that's part of it, and she also doesn't want to end up being, raped, which, fair enough. But at the same time, I'm kind of watching that and I'm like, shouldn't the love story of this movie have been between those two instead of Daniel Day-Lewis and another white chick? Wouldn't that be more interesting and tragic in that, like, final moment than to focus so much of the time on this other plot that, like, ultimately doesn't really mean all that much?
And like, think about like exactly what you're saying and what I'm saying about like where the movie chooses to place its nuance at the expense of the indigenous characters, because you have that, right? Like you have that really great scene where they're just staring at each other on the cliff and then she jumps and it's really, really sad. But then you also have the British soldier dude that doesn't trust Hawkeye the entire movie, and then at the end volunteers himself up instead of translating accurately and letting Hawkeye burn at the stake, and then Hawkeye, as like a final act of mercy, shoots him in the head so he doesn't have to burn alive. Like there is like a growing respect between these two guys that the movie actually develops, and at the end when you hear him getting burned alive and Hawkeye shoots him in the head to kill him, that's a good moment. That's sincere. That hits. But it does kind of open up that other question of like, okay, but what about all these other characters who you want to say you want to make complicated that you then intentionally don't to make the white people more complicated?
Yeah, it's just kind of the underlying, like, issue with the movie. It's not, like, wholly bad. It's not, like, because I've watched original Star Trek. There's an episode where Captain Kirk gets, like, dropped off on a planet that just has Native Americans, or maybe the fucking time travel. That show should just have been about time travel. The number of times they just end up on, it's Earth, but...
I'm thinking of Doctor Who.
No. It's Star Trek. Star Trek, the original series, is at least 1/3 stories that are either we time traveled or we found a planet that's exactly like Earth.
And a lot of them have...
That's at this point in history.
Nazi episodes, too.
Yeah. But, like, I remember that episode of Star Trek where, Kirk's like, and here's how you make a lamp, you savages. It's just fucking dumb. And then, like, the fucking previous lead male of the tribe, like, hates him and tries to betray him. It's a little fucking piece of shit. Original series Star Trek. Again, talking about that thing of, like, it was so far ahead of its time, and then you watch it now and you realize how far behind its, like, current standards it is, and then you think of, like, damn. Imagine living back then. I was going somewhere. But yeah, so, like, it's just odd to watch this movie and realize that there's so much focus on this romance between the two white characters when, like, the big tragedy of the movie is with these characters who's, like, teases the idea of a romantic dynamic with, but it never actually spends much time with. It's just a really, it's just a really odd choice.
Yeah, it's rough because, like, there's a lot of stuff about the movie that I feel like is genuinely really good or interesting. It's just kind of unfortunate in terms of, like, the characters who get thrown under the bus to make that other stuff happen. I really like when Hawkeye and them get to that base that's under siege, and you're watching
that's the best scene in the fucking movie.
Yeah, no, it's great when they're all in the fort, and it basically just turns into like a goddamn John Ford movie where you're just like in the fortress with everybody, and they're all huddled around a fire, and they're talking about like what they should do to escape or not escape, and Hawkeye potentially getting hanged for sedition, and then watching the two generals like negotiate the terms of surrender. Like, that stuff is so good. And it's so interesting, and it doesn't like require much action. It's all just kind of like dialogue-driven political drama, and you can't help but think, Ah, yes, and in the background of this, the French have hired their evil Native American henchmen. And it just kind of undercuts the whole thing.
Okay, so I do want to take this moment to talk about some of the actual history
Okay,
of
yeah.
the siege of that fort. Um,
Yes, please, absolutely.
so the movie has that whole scene with the truce, or not the truce, the terms of surrender, and legitimately though, the natives that the French had recruited, because a lot of this comes down to like the population differences between France and Britain within the Americas at that time, where there were like basically industrialists in America from the French side, but they were just people there to work to like do business, fur trappers mostly. Whereas the British were proper colonialists. They were here to start and live the rest of their lives and found future generations. So when the war broke out, French were outnumbered like, oh, what was the population was like 1,000,000 British to 60,000 French. So it's just this huge numbers gap. So the French actually went out and hired and allied with and recruited the Native Americans to be their thing. The British got some, but the French were like really aggressive, and they were like giving them arms and everything to get them on their side to fight for them in this war. So this fort that is under siege is actually a fort that was under siege in real life, and the terms of surrender are actually slightly better in the movie than they were in real life. They actually are not too terrible. The major distinction that is of note is while the British are allowed to leave with their rifles, both in the film and in reality they weren't allowed to take any ammunition with them, however.
Makes sense.
Okay, so this ambush that happens is about 10 times bloodier than the one depicted in the movie because the other guys can't fight back.
Makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. So you talk about like, oh, it seems undercut by the French just sicking the Native Americans on them. It's like, I mean, whether or not the French did it intentionally is, one of those things where you can read the letters of the person at the time and kind of make your own conclusions of it if it seems like something he'd do or not. The reality is it happened. From what I was looking into, the history seemed to say that it was more about the native warriors being like, no, we came for war. You can't just not let us go home without prisoners and jewels and stuff that we've captured. Like, that's an insult to us as warriors if we do not come home with this stuff. So, you may have made peace, but we're not done. Seems to be the general consensus.
Accurate or not as accurate, or however you want to describe it. I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think that stuff's all fine. My problem is more just like how the movie chooses to like really take its time and make you understand the details of the French and the British terms of surrender and the inner politics of the fort while you're in it. And then instead of having like any of that nuance and careful dialogue for the Indian characters, you just have the French guy going like, I may have surrendered, twirling my evil mustache, but you, however, did not. And then just like having that really lazy scene of like, this literally could have just been from like an old 40s serial. Like none of that is given to those characters at all. And that feels like it undercuts a lot of the more interesting stuff that was happening.
Maybe I can't fully disagree with you there, but I will say at the same time we just get that fucking fantastic scene where old dude goes into his origin story in that moment.
Yeah.
And that's like, again, that whole section of when they show up to the fort, speaking of while I was looking into stuff, the director was really adamant about how he didn't want the cannons just firing gunpowder.
Yeah.
that he actually wanted you to be able to see like smoke trailing through the sky of where the projectiles were going. So they actually used like black basketballs
Yeah, yeah,
to
it's
be able to
nuts.
shoot stuff. It's a really cool detail, and I found that out. I was like, oh, that's fucking dope. Why don't they do that more? That looks so good. And I didn't
They
even
also,
I didn't even notice it, but it was like so perfect, you know?
there's so much stuff about the background and the sets and stuff in this movie where Michael Mann finally having a budget like gets to go all out and he doesn't make compromises about any of it. It's funny going back and watching the behind the scenes of this movie now, because even in the 90s when those like DVD features and stuff were coming out, they were talking about like how no one would actually do this and how most people would just resort to using like studio lots or green screen and stuff, but Michael Mann instead decides to like have this stuff built and scout on location and things like that. And it's funny how like even 30 years ago people had that same mentality of like practical versus CGI. And I think to great effect, part of why the movie works as well as it does is because it feels so visceral in the moments where it needs to. That whole massacre of the British troops, that battle scene, that's fantastic. That's up there with like any of the best old school war epic battle scenes like I've ever seen. Everything
Dude,
about
just
that.
that moment of when they're like trekking through the woods and you just see how many dudes are about to descend on this column.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was just watching that, I'm like, oh, fuck.
Even
That's
just like
terrifying.
scale of it is nuts, and then just like the sort of like personal gauntlet where you see Daniel Day-Lewis running after that woman and like taking on guys one at a time where all war is going on behind him, all that stuff looks so good.
Mm-hmm. No, it really fucking does. Like, basically, when they show up to the fort until the end of that massacre, not even that, until Daniel Day-Lewis fucking jumps out the waterfall. I think that is like the best part of this movie. You talk about like you really like the first half hour. That has some like gorgeous shots and like really cool moments in it and stuff. But just that whole section of the movie from arriving at the fort till the chase ending in the waterfall is just so fucking fantastic to me.
Yeah, I mean, it never, for me at least, it never like had me bored. It was never a movie where I feel this is a stretch of time where I'm uninvested in what's happening. It was really more of just this kind of push and pull effect where like I felt like scene to scene I was really loving what I was watching. And then I had to like pull myself back for a second and be like, huh, it's sort of weird how we have all of this interesting stuff happening. I wonder what's going on with the native characters. And then the native characters show up and I'm like, oh, maybe I don't like this movie anymore. And it's weird going back and forth like that because I want to be like as generous to it as I can, but there are some moments where I just sort of feel like the emotions or the conflict would hit harder if that stuff was allowed to be more to the forefront. And it's to the detriment of the movie that it sort of relies on tropes because everything else is so good about it. When you get to the scene towards the end where they've been captured, and Moga is talking to the chieftain, explaining what he wants and what they want to do, and like they're essentially negotiating for their lives. There is a lot of tension there. It is really interesting how the character relationships start to evolve in that moment of like the British dude selectively translating what Hawkeye is telling him and them sort of realizing that in this moment they are not enemies, they're just trying to find a way to escape with their lives, and how all of that ultimately culminates to them escaping and then the girl jumping off the cliff and stuff. Like, it's a really good tense scene, but it does open up a lot of these other questions I have of just like the conflict within the tribe itself is so fascinating. Why isn't that more of the movie?
And again, I think that's mainly just going to have to be, well, they were trying to adapt the book, and they probably just should have written their own story. Like, do you feel like sometimes certain things get adapted and worked on just because the, like, prestige of the name? Which, in all fairness to this book from the 1800s, it's a really fucking good title.
Yeah, just the Mohicans, it's great.
It's a fucking fantastic title. And then the way it all culminates in the end is so sad. And
Yeah.
I'm honestly glad that, it ends up not being the case, but, all he has to do is change the name of the tribe to one of the ones that was actually wiped the fuck out, and the plot still works. The message is still there. It might not be the last of the Mohicans, but it is about this idea of these, proud peoples being completely wiped out over time. And that's just really fascinating. I'm not really sure, because I've not read the book, I'm not sure how much of the, that, conversation around capitalism, is in the book. I wouldn't be surprised, though, because, this guy wrote a lot of shit, and he wasn't exactly the most popular guy for some of his opinions.
Well, the interesting thing about American colonial capitalism is a lot of those debates were ongoing for a very long time. Even the American founding fathers had dissenting opinions about whether or not capitalism and industrialization was the way forward for several decades after the U.S. gets founded too. So I wouldn't be surprised if you go back and read more of that dude's stuff to find a deeper critique of whether or not capitalism is the right way or not. I think where the movie gets anachronistic's not the right word, but where it gets kind of ahead of history is less about the capitalism debate and more about this sort of colonial identity debate.
And this is why we're gonna have to become America. That whole, that's probably the worst part of the movie.
Yeah, that's easily the worst part, where I sort of feel like that feels entirely out of place with the period you're trying to replicate, but okay.
Mm-hmm. No, that was objectively the silliest part of it to me, especially with the whole agreement between the British and the militia of oh, well, you can go back to defend your homes at any point if they come under threat. And it just reminded me of, you remember Monty Python and the Meaning of Life, where's the scene of the drill sergeant, and he's we're gonna go marching up and down the square.
Yep.
Unless any of you could think of something better you'd like to do, then go marching up and down the square. Actually, sir, I'd like to go home and just spend the day with my wife and kids. It's a really, really nice day, and I'd like to go do that. Oh, all right then. Why don't you go? The idea that the British would ever that any military in the history of ever would agree to those kind of terms. I'm right with the fucking hoity-toity British character that shows up. He's I can't believe that we're negotiating with them. Well, it's like this in the colonies, my friend. No, that's just bad military management, man. That's a terrible idea.
Yeah, the stuff with the Americas at that point gets really kind of strange because it feels like it's looking too much at the camera. But then you have the really, like you said, the really great last line of him calling himself the last of the Mohicans, and there is something you could do with that, right? Of this tension of if you are a native in these colonial times, you are watching your world disappear slowly, and you're watching people who should be charged with preserving it more and more getting enticed by the promises of the colonies. And so there is a legitimate lament of that old world is going. And that's sort of the heart of the movie, or at least it wants to be by the end. But then you have the idea of the colonists and turning the Americas into whatever representation of their government they would want. And the fact that they're not sort of more hard-lined about that British and the French side as they could be seems really strange. It feels like they're cutting all of the militia guys almost too much slack at a point. The sort of argument that happens about sedition should have been the threat from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of odd.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a weird movie. Why will not live under the yoke of tyranny? Okay, this is a different movie, guys. This is about the... It's weird because it's not that these ideas are not co-current, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
it's funny because some people attribute the start of the French Indian War to George Washington kind of fucking up on an early mission, and getting someone that should not have been killed, uh, and and that's like really interesting. So it's like and these growing sentiments and angers toward the colony and the motherland and all this stuff. That's really, and historical events don't just happen out of nowhere. There's always like these seeds and these growing waves of things that bring these to a head in these big historical things. The Civil War didn't just happen because Abraham Lincoln just woke up one day and decided no more slavery, right? Like, it was an ongoing movement from the beginning of the fucking country about whether or not we were going to keep slaves.
Yeah, I mean, there so much of the ratifying of the Constitution dealt on whether or not they would agree to the terms for slavery.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so it's like these are like big moments that like take a lot of time to kind of fester and brew. So it's not wrong to assert the idea that some of these attitudes would definitely be coming to a head because 1759 is when this is set, or 1758 or something like that.
1750s-ish, yeah. 1757.
Yeah, 1757. So, like, you're really only talking about 20 years before the fucking Revolutionary Wars. So, yes, it's absolutely fair that some of these notions are going to be kind of coming to a head, kind of frothing under the surface. At the same time, though, it just, that's not really where your focus is. Mm-hmm. As, like, just from a storytelling perspective, that's not really where your focus is. This movie really is not about the American Revolution in any way. It's about the death of the Native Americans, which, of course, would be accelerated by the lack of these old colonial powers and their agreements with the Native people from when they first came to these lands. But ultimately, that's just outside of the focus of the story, and that's what makes it feel so awkward of when it's coming up. It's not that there's no reasonable take as to why it would come up. It's just that it doesn't really have anything to do with what you're talking about, so why bring it up in the first place?
It sort of reminds me a little bit of why I think those older 1950s and 60s historical epics kind of work as well as they do, because they're able to cover similar time periods over the long courses of history and still feel like they can be about multiple things. And if you go back and watch something like Spartacus or Ben-Hur, the way those movies kind of structured are like you have these 30 to 50 minute segments that tell essentially complete stories within a specific context and then move you towards the next segment. They're essentially like watching mini arcs happen over the course of like 4 or 5 hours. And so you can afford to spend a lot of time getting into the nitty gritty and make the movie about a lot of things, because you could tell the entire narrative history of all of the causes, or as many causes as you can fit into the runtime, that contribute to this one singular event. And when you're watching a movie kind of as short as this is, you just don't have the...
I was very surprised that it's only a 2-hour runtime.
Right? It's
I just assume anything that's... I assumed, like, when I told Haley that I gotta watch this movie, I was like... I didn't even say the name of the movie. I was like, yeah, I gotta watch a long movie tonight. And she's like, oh, okay, well, I'm just gonna take my shower, go ahead and start it. I'm like, okay. And then I, like, started, I'm like, oh, it's only 2 hours. Huh. Yeah. That's weird. Just anything that's touching, like, historical era, I assume off the bat is gonna be a minimum of 2.5 to 3 hours. And that's your basement a lot of the time on these.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts, like, how short this movie is and how efficient it is. So it kind of has the opposite problem, where it's like there are a lot of nuances I know you want to cover, but you really don't have the runway for them because the movie's already complicated as it is.
I mean, you could probably recut certain things. Not that I think you should, but you could because large stretches of this movie are like action beats that just kind of show our characters running across landscapes. But ultimately, I enjoyed a lot of that stuff a lot more than I did the other stuff that they're trying to sneak into the movie. Something I kind of realized, there's like about a 10-minute stretch of this movie toward the climax where there's almost no dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's bizarre, and like I didn't even really notice it until like in retrospect. I was like, but yeah, no, for real. Like that whole time that they're chasing after him, no one really says anything. They're just going, and it's really intense and really fascinating to watch.
You see a lot of the muscles Michael Mann has developed up to this point get a really big showcase in this movie. But then he dials all of this stuff up to 11 just 3 years later when Heat comes out. Because Heat also has like those extended sequences where so much is going on and 10 minutes have passed and you realize no one has said a fucking word. Just because the paranoia of the whole thing hits so hard. And it's funny too because Michael Mann goes from like a historical epic that's under 2 hours to making a then contemporary urban 3-hour crime epic. And you sort of see like this is a dude who doesn't view the money and the resources as just like a function to go big all the time. This is a person that if he's going to get a lot of money to make a movie, you're going to see every cent of it on screen. And so you don't need like a 3-hour movie where you're just doing large sweeping camera shots of the entire battlefield from the sky. You do that stuff inside of a perspective where the action can feel grounded. So when you're looking at the sheer scale of people attacking and fighting, there's weight to it. There's not just kind of like top-down awe. And even when he's doing that, even when he's kind of indulging in like the sweeping landscapes and stuff, the movie still just like moves. It never really has a lull, except maybe some of the travel towards the fort stuff is a little dry sometimes, but nothing terrible.
I mean, yeah, maybe. Again, I genuinely just enjoyed some of the cinematography of those like trekking through the wilderness kind of things. Mm-hmm. That stuff was honestly just more. Normally, stuff like that would kind of bore me, and I'd kind of be like, "All right, get to the fucking point already." But again, it's only a 2-hour movie, so I've got just a much better taste for it.
For sure.
In this context, than I do some of the other stuff that the movie seems to get distracted and spending some time on. Like, I feel like the love triangle plot just really not needed at all.
Yeah, that
or at least if it was needed, it was needed for different characters than for Daniel Day-Lewis.
The cinematographer for this does a lot of Michael Mann's other movies too, so you kind of see the same style carried throughout between Manhunter, this, Heat, The Insider. I don't know if he does Ali off the top of my head or not, but it's a similar style all the way through, and so like the kinds of like cool sweeping shots that you're seeing is something that Mann does a lot of, and Mann does a lot of like symmetry too, where you see the entire frame sort of engulfed in one color, but it's perfectly mirrored on left and right. He also does a lot of like fun little visual tricks with that, where like certain actors or characters will favor one half of the frame, and then their opposing character will favor the other half of the screen. And so when they're fighting or they're in conflict with each other, the camera will keep cutting back and forth to them in different locations, but they'd still be occupying the same side of your screen the whole time. And a lot of that little stuff you see in this movie too. And it's one of those things where it's like you're not conscious of it when you're watching it, but then you go back and you try to figure out like what exactly had you so gripped on something, or what exactly made this like particular conflict feel like it hit. And it's those little details of just how clever and creative he is with all of those visual choices.
When they started fucking running up that mountain to chase old dude down, I was just like, shit, man.
Mm-hmm.
That looks hard.
Yeah.
want to take a quick step back and talk about cinematography for like kind of a negative thing. And I'm not really sure if it's just like maybe waterfalls of scale are just really hard to shoot, but like when they're like camped out in the cave under the waterfall and you get a couple like establishing shots of like the big waterfall part, not the little tiny one that they like went over, but like the full scale one that they're hiding out under. Did it look like it switched to stock footage to you? Like it just looked different. Like even the film quality looked different to me.
It looked different. I wouldn't say if it switched to stock footage. It did sort of feel like one of those things where, like, compared to everything else, I wasn't sure on location for that particular thing. Like, almost that was more on, like, a soundstage setup to make a crappy waterfall.
I don't know. Like I was just really, it just felt completely separate to everything else in the
Yeah.
film.
Yeah, that's
Which
fair.
doesn't make sense to me because they're literally shooting around other waterfalls. Maybe the ones that they had access to just weren't big enough or didn't look like they'd be able to hide a cave under it. Apparently, that scene is like the whole basis for why old dude wrote the book in the first place, because he was like adventuring with some British friends, and they like came across that cave, and one of the friends remarked that'd be like the perfect scene or the perfect setting for a scene between two lovers. And like now the very cave of waterfall that they were exploring is just kind of, it's all been like industrialized and dammed up, so that waterfall, that cave no longer exists.
It's interesting, though, because I wonder if the reason that particular scene looks the way it does as distinct from the rest is actually because of a cinematographer issue where the movie is lit a really specific way because Mann's got a very specific like visual style. No matter what Michael Mann movie you're watching, you're always going to watch scenes that are like washed in blue. That's just a thing he does. But for this movie, there were a lot of constraints on the things you could physically use to light the scenes to get that effect without at the same time feeling too modern or artificial. So they didn't want to just have like a bunch of like phosphorescent tubes or bulbs and stuff to light the sets. They wanted to do things that were like more natural or took advantage of the actual outdoor surroundings that they were in. And as you can probably imagine, doing that and having the entire frame go blue like that is really hard. And so I wonder if some of the scenes where he needed the screen to look like that, they had to make certain kind of compromises where they're just like, we can't shoot here even though it's the perfect location because the lighting I want does not physically work here.
I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I resolved the other day because I've really liked watching all Man's movies, but I feel like if anyone's ever going to meet him, they'd ask him all the same questions about all the same movies. Like, they'd ask about Heat, they'd ask about Collateral, they'd ask about Ferrari, like that kind of stuff. But if I ever met the dude, I would just want to talk about why Last of the Mohicans and why The Keep. Because those are such weird movies to make in between stuff like Manhunter and Heat.
So I just remember watching Manhunter because I got really into the Hannibal series at one point in my life. That was one of my edgy teenage-ian series. And I remember watching Manhunter and just being so disappointed compared to all the other Hannibal movies, including Hannibal Rising.
I don't know, man. I watched that a couple weeks ago. I fucking adored it. It's hinged thing ever, and I thought it was great.
I mean, maybe it's just because I watched Red Dragon first, and
Oh, maybe.
I'm sorry, but fucking like Ed Norton and Anthony Hopkins can just fucking outact circles around everybody else in the world. Like, it's just an unfair combination of actors.
See, but that's the thing about it is like the Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter is definitely an extremely iconic version of that character, But watching Brian Cox play him in a way where he's got more regality to him, and then being contrasted with a guy who's playing literally the most unhinged Will Graham I have ever seen, I think just as a dynamic works way better.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Again, just Ed Norton's one of my favorite actors.
Yeah, he's really good.
So it's just never been any contest to me. I've always like, I remember when I worked at Goodwill, we got like a multi-pack of like all the Hannibal movies in, and I was describing them to a friend. I'm like, oh, don't even bother watching Manhunter, just watch Red Dragon. And he's like, wait, what? I go, oh, they're the same movie. He's like, really? I'm like, yeah, they decided to like go back and remake it after Silence of the Lambs was so successful with Anthony Hopkins. And it's funny because it's the one that takes place first, and it's the last one they made with Anthony Hopkins. So for a long time in the 90s, Anthony Hopkins just was basically recast as Hannibal Lecter. It's like, oh yeah, we made Manhunter. That was mildly successful, so we're going to make Silence of the Lambs. Let's just recast everyone. It's fine. No one really cares. Holy shit, this is iconic. All right, well, let's make the sequel, but not follow all the beats from the book. Okay. Well, I guess we can go back and remake Manhunter, but let's call it something different. We're kind of not talking about Last of the Mohicans anymore. Do we want to... do we have any final thoughts on this, or do we want to wrap up?
I'll just say, of the Michael Mann movies I've seen in order lately, this is definitely my least favorite. But that doesn't mean it's bad. I think in general the trouble with this movie is it's sandwiched between movies in his career that I think are infinitely better, and it's got all the hallmarks of the lesser man movies that I don't like, and so that just kind of forces it to be on the bottom. But it's still an entertaining watch, and I feel like it is kind of a worthwhile movie to talk about. Like when we disparage some of the white savior stuff and like the noble versus the savage kind of stuff that the movie does, it still kind of fosters an interesting conversation about that as a trope and as that as a historical thing in film that was really prominent during the 90s. So I'd say even if you were like afraid of that kind of stuff, that's almost another reason to watch it, to just get kind of an appreciation for this is what we were doing. This is how that movie tries to subvert it, and whether or not it ultimately succeeds or not is an interesting conversation in and of itself.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's an interesting watch for that reason, among others. Okay. Do we want to do a rating for Last of the Mohicans?
Sure. We can give it. I'll give it. I don't want to give it too low. No. Okay. I think this is fair. I'll give it 3 out of 5. Burning British soldiers at the stake.
Okay. I'm also gonna give it 3 out of 5. King Solomon ass Indian chiefs who's all like, okay, we'll ransom the British soldier, we'll kill the oldest daughter, and you can rape the youngest daughter and implant a child in her so that bloodline does not actually die. Just the most, and justice has been done.
You can tell that man patted himself on the back after he was done.
That dude went home and said, I did a good job today.
Honey, I made everyone happy today. You'll never believe it.
Oh, really? What'd you do? Wow.
Well, you see.
It was just like instantly everyone changed their fucking mind about what they wanted. No one was happy. No, you did it wrong. Kill me, let that one go, and then they're gonna save her. And even if they're like, I'm not happy about this at all. I don't want to rape her. Like, what did Chill do? He didn't even want to rape her. He just wanted to kill her. He just wanted the okay to fucking kill her.
So it's so wrong to just murder children. I mean, come on.
Nah, she's not a child.
She's like a teenager.
She is. That woman is easily in her 20s. Get the fuck out. The day that we actually do proper ages for historical figures on film is the day I am longing for. Never will we touch that shit. I guarantee it makes people too uncomfortable.
As a person that grew up watching Smallville, the idea that you cast people that are age appropriate is just a thing that's lost on me, because I'm thinking about how Clark Kent is starting high school, so he's 13 or 14, played by 25-year-old Tom Welling at the time. This dude is above college age, playing a freshman in high school. And at
Is
that
he
point,
over college age? I thought he was actually college freshman age when he
no,
started
because
playing.
college freshman would be 18 to 22 if you just do 4 years. And then if you did grad school for 2 years, then you'd be 24. So he's over 24, playing a kid who's a freshman in high school.
Yeah, no, it's a thing.
Does not work.
Never. We
Right,
will
yeah.
never do age appropriate casting for historical films or historical
got,
fantasy.
What do we
What
got
are we
for
doing next week? Yeah, what are we doing next week? Okay, this came up on my radar again, and I want to talk about how bad it is. So we're going to do Green Lantern Beware My Power, the recent-ish 2022, I think, direct-to-DVD DC animated film.
what is this?
Yeah, exactly. So,
Green Lantern,
everyone,
what was it?
Beware My Power. It's
Oh,
the
okay.
Jon Stewart-focused Green Lantern film. So, yep, that'll be a time. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
And I am amazed this exists.
And we are your geeky gentlemen, and we will be discussing things.